Hi everybody. I'll be starting out talking about the Sarantine Mosaic by Guy Gavriel Kay, which begins with Sailing to Sarantium as Book 1, and Lord of Emperors, Book 2. This particular duology is largely inspired by the Byzantine Empire. This is something very typical for Guy Gavriel Kay books. He likes to borrow from historical settings and historical inspiration, and then create a secondary fantasy world based on those things. It is also largely inspired by the poetry of William Butler Yeats. In fact, Kay says here in the acknowledgement of Book 1, I imagine it is obvious from the title of this work, but I owe a debt of inspiration to William Butler Yeats, whose meditations in poetry and prose on the mysteries of Byzantium led me there and gave me a number of underlying motifs, along with the sense that imagination and history would be at home together in this milieu. So that first book, Sailing to Sarantium, is based on Yeats's poem, Sailing to Byzantium, and I did not read the poem until after I finished the duology, and I immediately could see the parallels there. There's another poem called Byzantium that is like a sister poem to Sailing to Byzantium, and I found this out because I found a wonderful written review online talking about this. So I highly recommend checking it out. I'll leave a link in the description below. And usually I try to avoid reading written reviews before writing out my own thoughts. But I did go ahead and look this up, and it did help me appreciate what I read all the more. And that said, I guess I'll go ahead and say it here. I was not as hyped about this duology as many of my other friends who are huge Kay fans. That is not to say I didn't like it. I liked it. It just didn't reach the emotional highs for me that Kay's other books did, and I did have a couple of nitpicks. In fact, it's weird because I did a Tigana review earlier this year. I had more glaring nitpicks with Tigana than this one, but Tigana did get bigger emotional moments for me. It did hit emotionally more for me than this book did, or this duology did. But starting out, to give you an overview of this, the prologue of Book 1 starts out in Sarantium, the fabled city as it's described here on the back of the book. And we are dealing with a very politically charged environment as the emperor has died, he has left no heir, and there is conversation about the story surrounding his death being embellished, and that is important, I think, later on in the story. But we need a new emperor, and this leads to a huge conspiratorial plot that starts to unfold. Then we go to chapter 1, which takes place 12 years later, and we are in the kingdom of Verena, which is much further west than Sarantium, when the imperial post comes and gives a summons to one of the mosaicists there. And rather than go into a whole lot of plot here, I'll just say that there's a mosaicist named Crispin, who we follow in this duology. And Crispin, his backstory is that he lost his daughters and his wife to a plague. And this is something that he has had a lot of difficulty processing. He's described as an angry person as a result of this. But it is interesting that we are following an artist in this duology. We are following a number of other perspectives as well. And this was something that I appreciated about the duology, is that when we talk about the idea of the Sarantine Mosaic, it's important because Crispin is taking part in creating this mosaic in the city of Sarantium for the emperor there. And the idea of this mosaic, it does play a role, I think, in the themes of the stories. From here, I'll go ahead and point you to the wonderful discussion that I had about the Sarantine Mosaic here on my channel. I hosted a discussion on this particular duology with the Library Ladder, Jake Bishop, and Red Fairy Books, in which we talked about the symbolism of this mosaic and this sanctuary and what it represents as far as the themes are concerned. So one of those themes is legacy, and legacy it's important, I think, considering the role of loss, of grief, and of the fact that so many people who are great artists in the world, who created these monuments that remain with us, that have meaning for those long after they live, sometimes the creators of those art forms are no longer remembered. But not only that, but the monuments themselves represent something about the time period, something about what we revere. So I feel like there's a lot of conversation in this duology about how art is a means to preserve. It's a means to honor that which we revere. And it's also it means to reconcile disparate parts that are seemingly incongruent with one another. That's a huge part of this duology, especially as there are conflicting religious beliefs that occur in this empire. So we have a lot of mysticism that takes place in this duology, and that's related to the magic in this duology. A lot of mysticism related to pagan folklore, and we also have what's called the Jadeite religion, which is analogous to Christianity. This is something that we also talked about in the Guy Gavriel Kay book, Lions of Alrazan. There's also the Jadeite religion in that particular book. So Kay does seem to have a similar universe that he pulls from for certain books. A lot of his worlds, or I think almost every book I've read so far, has 2 moons. And so that is something to consider when you're reading this book, is the role of art and what it's trying to do. And also the concept of the mosaic is important too, not only to reconcile aspects, like I said, that are seemingly at odds with one another, not only to preserve, not only to honor, but also I think that this mosaic itself is somewhat representative of the story aspect, because this particular duology, like I said, it incorporates so many different perspectives. We do get our main perspective, the mosaicist, the artist that we follow, but we also get perspectives of people at court. We get perspectives of a sandal maker and a charioteer, and we get all these different lifestyle perspectives of Sarantium. From here, I'm going to transition to talking about the tone of this duology, because this is something that I really appreciate about Kay's writing style. I feel as though the tone of this duology, it seems to shift between something that's sort of melancholy and wistful and reverent, and then it switches also to political intrigue, to court politics and machinations, and those particular conversations have a great deal of haughtiness behind them with the people at court. Then we also have that mysticism that occurs in the stories. There's also an agnostic quality behind the mysticism, because characters don't really know who to pray to. They don't really know what it means when certain events or experiences happen that are associated with one way of thinking. And then in the story, you also get conflicting experiences as well. But I think that the mysticism, some of the magic involving certain magical creatures, I'll just leave it at that, they felt to me a little quirky in humor. So I think there's a little bit of a quirky humor at play. But what I loved the most of all those different flavors of tone that we get in the duology were those melancholy moments, were those wistful moments. It brings forth a great sense of autumn. In fact, autumn is prominent in book 1, and I did bring this up in my autumn recommendations video, because I did talk about how I was reading Sailing to Sarantium when I made that video. I was reading the beginning of that book. So I do think that this duology is a perfect autumn read, at least book 1. But I think it's also special about Kay's writing, because it takes a certain amount of skill as a writer to bring forth those tones, to bring forth that sense of melancholy, that sense of longing, that sense of yearning, and do it in a way that feels authentic and doesn't feel too sentimental. But the challenge for me with this story, there were a couple of things that made this not a favorite, made me not as hyped about this duology. And I already kind of revealed one of those things, which is that this duology just didn't reach the emotional heights for me that other Kay books did. There were certainly some powerful moments, but they just didn't blow my mind. And the other thing that made this not quite a favorite for me had to do with the female characters. I felt like all the female characters in this story were highly idealized, and they were quite a bit horny. They were quite a bit randy. There wasn't a single time I feel like there were a male and female character alone in a scene that they didn't get it on. And it felt like there was no build up to that. It just sort of happened. One of those scenes I thought was beautifully written, but I also didn't really appreciate the power imbalance. So I felt like there was very little restraint when it came to that, and I just didn't really like it. It made me feel a little less connected to our main character as well, because I felt like there was a little bit of wish fulfillment with all these women who just couldn't wait to get their hands in his trousers. So that just didn't quite work for me. I think that there were some really good side characters that were described in the story, male side characters, I should add. But as far as the female characters, I just wanted a little bit more from them. Another criticism that I'm taking from my experience, and this is largely based on the discussion and processing my thoughts some more about the second book, I feel as though the denouement in book 2 really takes its time. Kay is very interested in tying together every loose end, and there is a skill to be able to do that, but some of the ending storylines felt a little convenient, and I didn't feel quite emotionally satisfied with how certain things resolved. And another thing to mention is that I actually really enjoyed the beginnings of both of these books more than the middle and endings of these books. But I still, like I said, I know that sounds highly critical, but I still actually enjoyed them for the most part. It wasn't like I hated the books or disliked my experience. It just didn't quite go as far as I wanted it to. And at the same time, I loved the court politics. I thought the court politics were a lot of fun, lots of scheming, lots of conspiracy. There were a lot of interesting moments as far as that's concerned. I did like the magic, but yeah, this just didn't hit the highs for me that I had hoped. From here, I'll go ahead and talk about The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This was my first Toni Morrison novel, and it is also her first novel, if I understand correctly. It says that the earliest copyright is 1970. This book is about systemic racism. It's about white beauty standards. It follows a young girl who is impregnated by her father. That happens so early on in the book, or it's suggested so early on in the book. I don't think that's a spoiler. And it is so harrowing. It is such a bleak and disturbing psychological journey for all the characters involved, specifically because this takes place in 1941, and the community of characters that we follow, self-loathing and racism are their norms. And I think it's just the way that those things are normalized in the story that made this so hard to read. But there are such difficult things that occur in this story. In addition to a father raping his daughter, we also follow a pedophile at one point. We notice that women are made either to be prostitutes in the story or ideal servants to white people. This is a very difficult read, but at the same time, Toni Morrison is a brilliant writer. I am not overhyping this. I'm not overstating this. I know I've heard this many times about Morrison's writing. I know she's a Nobel Prize winning author, but I think the hype is real here. Every single word she chooses, every single sentence, everything has impact. Everything is pointing to something very precise. I felt as though every sentence burned. It left an afterburn, but it also made it so hard to read. I did not want to pick this book up. Every day I had to brace myself to pick this book up, like I would brace myself to rip off a Band-Aid. And the structure is really compelling. Morrison starts these chapters with these idealized childhood statements. That was how I read them anyway. So here's the statement. Here is a house. Here is the house. It is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty. Here is the family. Mother, father, Dick, and Jane live in the green and white house. They are very happy. See Jane. She has a red dress. She wants to play. Who will play with Jane? Everything feels very much like a childhood drawing coming to life. Like you're looking at a crayon colored drawing of an idealized child life, but then you go into the reality of what's occurring in the household. And it's so uncomfortable. It is so disturbing. And we also switch a lot of times between first person and third person. There are italicized passages in first person. Structurally, everything comes together very well, and the metaphors are very powerful in this story as well. So I think that Morrison just has a way with words. What a great writer. And if you're interested in audiobooks, I did pick up the audiobook and immersion read the second half of this book. I just read with my eyes for the first half. Morrison narrates the audiobook, and she's a phenomenal narrator as well, as you can imagine. I also highly recommend reading her notes about this. So in the physical copy, it's the foreword of the book, but if you have the audiobook, it's the notes at the end of the book. Either way, she explains why she felt like this was not successful And at least for my purposes, I don't agree. I don't think it was not successful. I think she very successfully brought forward a story that she needed to tell without telling you what to think. I felt like she showed you everything. And because of that, I could see how this would be lost upon certain readers, especially because it was published in 1970, like I said, first published in 1970. So I can imagine that the conversation around a story like this, the understanding of the deeper meaning of systemic racism, about how every character, even characters who are part of the problem or perpetuating the problem, are also part of a system that is perpetuating a problem, causing them to be where they are. It's a very intricate web. It's a messy web. So I can understand why this would not be easy to grasp if you were reading this even a decade ago or 2 decades ago. I feel like there's a lot more conversation now and understanding now about this topic, so there might be different conversations about this type of book now than there were when it was written. But I think it's highly worthwhile to pick it up. I did have this as a read-along in the Fireside Discord, and we had about 5 of us who were reading this together, about 20 pages a day, 30 pages a day, and just had some of the best conversations. Everybody brought forward so many insights, so many thoughts. It was just such a rich discussion, and this is a book that's worthy of very rich discussion. So I'm so glad that I read it, but I'm gonna have to brace myself. It might be a while before I can pick up my next Morrison book because it was heavy. It was heavy emotionally. It was just a lot. I'll go ahead and add that I did make progress in It by Stephen King, but I did not finish in the month of September. That will carry over into October. And I did start the very beginning of The Great Ordeal, made it past the prologue, and I'm excited to get more into that. I also started an audiobook, a nonfiction audiobook called The Anxious Generation. Let me know if you've heard of it. And that's been interesting so far. But that is all for now. I want to thank you so much if you watched this video. Please let me know in the comment section below if you've read any of the books I've mentioned, if you're planning to read any of the books I've mentioned. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.